Anyway, thank you so much for joining us virtually for today's program on memoir writing with Dr. Rochelle Almeida. Rochelle is a devoted and beloved member of the Pequot Library family. She's a member of the Meet the Author Committee and with her husband Lou, co-winner of the Stanley Crane Volunteer of the Year Award for dedication to our book sale. Outside of Pequot, she is a professor of the Humanities and Global Cultures, South Asian Civilization and Liberal Studies at New York University. She is a prolific international freelance journalist, blogger, research scholar, and creative writer who has taught writing in the US and abroad, most recently in Uzbekistan, on a Fulbright Nehru Senior Research Fellowship. She's also an editor of 3 anthologies, the author of 3 monographs, and a fictional memoir. So needless to say, I think we will all learn a lot this morning about memoir writing. So before I hand it over to Rochelle, just one last, some housekeeping. I am gonna have you all muted just to reduce background noise while Rochelle is giving her presentation, but we will stop periodically for questions, at which time we'll ask you to do the raise your hand function, which we can cover if anybody has questions about that at that time. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Rochelle.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine. That was such a great introduction. Really shouldn't have been that long, but that's great. Thank you. To all of you, I can't thank you enough for registering and for being part of this event. It gives me the greatest pleasure to have people from all over the world on this Zoom link. So I would like to say, first of all, a very big thank you to the Pequot Library for organizing this event and for inviting me to be a part of its creative writing series with a special slot, the memoir writing slot. My special thanks to Christine Catallo, who's taken so much trouble to put this Zoom link together. I'd also like to say thank you to Caroline Crawford, who monitored the entire event and made it happen. And of course, very especially to the director of the Pequot Library, Stephanie Coakley, without whom we would never have been able to do this. I know that all of us who are local and who are here close by in Southport miss the library so much and can't wait for the day when those doors will open and we'll be able to go through them and find our own special corner where we can curl up with a book. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wait a little longer for that pleasure. But in the meanwhile, to be able to do this and to continue our event programming through social media, through Zoom and other internet resources is just a tremendous wizardry of modern technology. And I'm very pleased and very honored, honestly honored, that I am the first person to be doing this for the Pequot Library. So I've sort of started the Zoom trend. And to think that I'm going out to the whole world right now, because if you've just joined in, you probably don't know that we have people all the way from England and from India. There are people from Bombay, and then all over the United States, from California, New York, and then Long Island, and then of course lots of people from local Connecticut towns. So welcome all of you. I'm just delighted to have you, and thank you once again, Pequot Library. You don't know how thrilled we all are that the programming is still continuing. Also, I have to say I have people from Canada, so a big shout out to them too. I must thank a lot of people, including my husband Lou, who publicized this event and told a lot of people about it. So I'm just really happy. I also wanted to let you know that this was planned as a broadcasting, not planned as a broadcasting event. It was meant to be a very small, very private event in the Pequot Library itself, with about 15 people maybe seated around a table and actually workshopping, that is actually writing, while I was instructing or supervising them. Obviously, we can't do that now because this is a remote method we're using. And so from time to time, I'm just going to ask questions because we're not going to be able to write and we're not going to be able to share our writing or literally workshop it, which is critique it. So we're not going to be able to do that. I will ask you from time to time if you would like to ask questions. I will ask you to talk about some aspects of my book that you might have read that remain with you, just so that you don't get sick of hearing the sound of my voice, and will hear other voices from other parts of the world if they would like to participate. So please feel free to participate. And when you do that, of course, before you do that, you will have to unmute your little mic so that I can actually hear you. So very good. Let's begin. I'm going to start off by just talking about what memoir writing is all about and where the word comes from. So memoir is a French word, really. It means memory, and it brings to mind the English word memory as well as the English word remember. So it's about what you want to remember about your life, and then how you want to make it more concrete by actually putting it down on paper. And that's how you make a memory a memoir. And I think that's the most important thing to remember. So let's go through some very famous travel writers or memoir writers through the years who made memoirs out of their travels. And they are people whose work we've read or whose work we identify with. And here are some of them. At the extreme top left-hand corner, you have Marco Polo, of course, 14th century travel writer who kept a journal and wrote his memoirs on his travels from Genoa in Italy to China. And he was the one who actually wrote about the fabled East. He was the one who introduced the glory of ancient India to other parts of the world. He also brought Chinese noodles from China to Italy. And so while we have to thank the Italians for pasta, it was thanks to Marco Polo who brought it over from China to Italy. Next in the middle there, you have on in the top row middle is Mark Twain. And Mark Twain wrote a book called Innocents Abroad, which was published in 1869, based on his travels to Europe and the Holy Land. And he sent reports of his travels based on his memoirs to a newspaper in California called the Alta California. And he, of course, made fun of his fellow Americans as he observed the strange beings they became when they were in a foreign country. And so his memoirs are quite hilarious. On the right-hand corner, top row, we have Jack Kerouac, of course. That's his book was On the Road, written in 1957. And it was about a trip that he took with a couple of friends across the United States. The names of the travelers are changed in this autobiographical account of the wild times they had. And it is from people like Mark Twain, I guess, that I took the idea of changing all the names in my book. I also wanted to bring anonymity to the people I was going to be writing about. And one of the ways you do that is by changing names. On the bottom row, extreme left, we have Peter Mayle. And he wrote A Year in Provence in 1989. So he was an Englishman who left England and went to live in Provence in the south of France for a year after he retired from his high-speed life in advertising. And it's a very amusing account of getting accustomed to living in another country and dealing with the idiosyncrasies of the French, as they too dealt with the strangeness of an Englishman in France who could barely speak their language. The book became a bestseller and ended up with him writing several sequels to it, such as Toujours Provence, etc. So he became big with that memoir. In the center on the bottom row, you may probably all recognize Frances Mays, who wrote Under the Tuscan Sun, based again on her purchase of an estate in Cortona in Tuscany. And she decided to take a ramshackle cottage and a neglected piece of land and to bring it back to snuff. And the whole book was about her attempt to do that through several summers that she would keep going back and forth as a university professor teaching writing. And then, of course, there's Elizabeth Gilbert, who everybody knows. Eat, Pray, Love was her big bestseller in the year 2006. This is about an American woman who was having a hard time in her life. She had just gone through a divorce and was in a career that was going nowhere. So she decided to go to 3 different countries of the world. And in one of them, she would eat, and that was in Italy. She would pray in India when she went to an ashram. And then in Bali, in Indonesia, she decided she was going to find love. And again, it became a big hit. So these were the memoirs. These were the books that I had been writing for years, reading for years and years and years. I've been reading memoirs for about maybe 35, 40 years of my life. I love reading about people who talk about interesting phases of their lives or about very unique parts of the world to which they have traveled. And I figured, why don't I write a book as well? So I was bold enough to think about writing a book. And this was my book. So I'm going to hold it up for you so you can see it. It's called The Year the World Was Mine. And its subtitle is An Anglophile Hits a Half Century. And this book was launched about 6 months ago. Many of you may have already read it. We had a wonderful launch at the Pequot Library, for which I'm very grateful. And many local people were able to buy copies of the book at the local bookstore in Southport Village, which was quite wonderful. So I'm going to say a little bit about how I came to write my memoir and where my memoir sprang from before I talk about the mechanics of writing the book. So my book, The Year the World Was Mine, was based on a year that I spent teaching and working at NYU London when I was posted there. I had a project. I was going to do a research project on Anglo-Indians in the UK, and that was primarily why I was there in addition to teaching. And I decided that I would write a blog. And so a friend of mine created a blog for me. And every evening or early in the morning the next day, I would put a blog post as part of my blog. And I called that blog Rochelle's Roost in London. And basically, it was intended to be a record of what I was doing from day to day, just for my closest family members. That was for my husband and my daughter, so that they could keep track of my doings and be a part of my life there. That was the idea. But I soon discovered that it wasn't just my family members that were reading it, but extended family members, cousins. And then it was close friends in the US who started reading it. And then even perfect strangers, because then the friends began to tell their friends about it. And then before I knew it, there were a large number of people who were following my doings in London, and that they were beginning their day wherever they were, whether they were in Canada or California. While sipping their coffee in the morning, they would be reading about my day the previous day. And they began to say that they were living their lives vicariously through mine. And at the end of the day, I realized that they had made it something of a habit, because if they didn't see a blog post for 2 days, they'd send me an email and asked if I was all right, because they hadn't seen my blog post for 2 days. And that's when I realized that there was something to this blog. At the end of the year, when I returned home and I signed off and I waved them goodbye, they were bereft. And they kept saying, what are we going to do with our mornings? What are we going to do when we sip our coffee in the morning? Or there was a friend who said she read the blog post aloud to her husband last thing at night. And she said, oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? So that gave me the idea, why don't I convert the blog into a book? Now, it would mean a lot of work, of course. And I had come back to the States and gone back into my full-time job at NYU, teaching and doing advising and doing all the things that you do as a professor. So I really wouldn't have had the time, and I was worried. But I thought, let me give it a shot. So I had to take 350 blog posts and condense them into a book-sized manuscript with about 300 double-spaced pages and nothing more. And that was very difficult. It's a particularly difficult task when you love every word you've written, and then you can't decide what to keep and what to get rid of. So you have to make endless choices, because obviously you can't put everything that happened that year into the book. And you have to eventually, or that's what I came to realize, eventually you had to keep those bits that were most interesting and most relevant to the reader, not to yourself. So you might find something very interesting, but if your reader doesn't identify with it or doesn't think it's interesting to read, it's useless putting it there. So you have to keep in mind your reader more than anything else. So my manuscript went through countless drafts and endless numbers of reading by good friends of mine before I was able to whittle it down to size, before I was able to decide what to retain and what to drop. And before I was able to organize it into manageable, logical, compatible, and coherent chapters, because that's also part of the structure of the book. So it was a very slow process. And eventually the book was published 10 years after I lived in London. And I have to admit that I didn't take 10 years to write it. Through those 10 years, I would take the manuscript, I would write 2 chapters, and then I would put them aside. And then I'd be busy with another scholarly article that had a deadline that I needed to work on. So I'd be working on that. And then I'd go back to this manuscript. In fact, there was a time when I think I didn't look at the manuscript for 2 whole years. So it was a project I worked on in fits and starts. I would revise, I would start, I would stop. So I do not think personally that abandoning a book for a while it is still in progress is a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a good thing because it allows you to reread what you have written, what you have forgotten you've written with fresh and critical eyes, and to be ruthless about your editing, because that's when you'll say, oh no, this is unnecessary, I don't need this, and you can delete it. So it's a good thing to give yourself some space before you go back to reading something else again. So I think that you are not any the less a writer because your book has taken a long time to be completed. As long as it has improved with time, it doesn't matter how long it takes from start to finish, because there's one thing I lived by, and that is my rule of thumb as a writer. And that is Hemingway's words, the words of Ernest Hemingway. And Hemingway said, writing is rewriting. And that's what I discovered. I've always discovered this. So it's been my mantra as I have published all my books. You write and you rewrite and you write and you rewrite and you revise. And the more time and energy and sweat equity you put into revision, the better will be your final product. So that's a very, very important thing to remember. So I know that several of you have read my book. So as time goes by, I will ask you as we go ahead with this presentation, what aspects of it stayed with you or what worked for you as a memoir, because then you can share with the other people who have joined this meeting about those aspects of the memoir that were of value and that really worked and what didn't. So I think that's an interesting thing to do. So now let's go on to the aspects of writing, actually all writing, not just memoir writing, that we must all adhere to and we must all live by. So there are 2 primary aspects of writing: the what of writing and the how of writing. So it's all a question of what are you going to write about, or what do you put into your book or your manuscript. And then the second question is, of course, how. How am I going to express it, or how am I going to write what I want to write about? So let's go to the first bit, which is the what of writing. The what is basically the content. The content can be a number of different phrases aspects when it comes to memoir writing. It could be about a special phase in your life, maybe your childhood, which was an unusual childhood, different from everybody else's. Perhaps it was a childhood in which you grew up in an orphanage, or it may be a childhood with an adopted family or a foster family. So a phase in your life which is different from everybody else's would make a great memoir. Another interesting thing could be an extraordinary vacation, or a time that you spent away from your regular habitation and took on a different culture or a different part of the world, and what came out of that. And the more unusual, the better. For example, if you grew up or went on vacation to Tahiti, or you went to Mongolia, something like that could be very interesting. A friend of mine who is 90 years old, for her 90th birthday, took herself on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Now that's an extraordinary vacation, I think, and would make such a fantastic memoir, as she spent a whole month on a train in Siberia, right across the Trans-Siberian route. Quite amazing. You could also write about a particular season or a particular year, like I chose to write about my year, or several summers over a whole several years. That's what Frances Mays did with Under the Tuscan Sun. She wrote about several summers, or maybe just one unforgettable summer. Or it could also be about a special relationship that you might have had with a remarkable person who had a transformative impact on your life that you think you need to put down. A good example would be Mitch Albom, who wrote Tuesdays with Morrie. So Morrie coming into his life then gave him a chance to write that book. So that's as far as content is concerned. That is the what of your book. Let's move to the second bit, which is the how of your book, which is your style. What sort of a style are you going to use? And style is two aspects: your narrative voice and the time sequence that you choose. Now, these are all choices. It's up to you. This is entirely your call. This is, after all, your book, and this is, after all, your story. So you make these choices. You decide what will work. And you can always start off with one tense. So you can always start off with one tone and then decide it's not working for you and change it and rewrite and go back. That's what you do when you're revising. But in the narrative voice, the first thing you think about is the person. In what person are you going to speak? Are you going to speak in the first person? Are you going to be the I of the omniscient narrator, which in memoirs is the most common way to go? Or do you want to use the third person? And if you want to use the third person, you'd say he or she when you're actually referring to yourself. That's a little bit more complicated, but it is certainly something you could do. You would then need to look at tense. That is, are you going to talk in the past tense, in the present tense? Because it's a memoir and because it's based on your memories, almost invariably you would choose the past tense, and most memoirs are in the past tense. So if it is something that happened 10 years ago, a year ago, a month ago, even yesterday, it's the past. So you would speak in the past tense, and that's the easiest and the least complicated way to do it. We then move on to tone. This is the tone of voice. This is really what people call the voice of the author. And this is really the most difficult thing to master. And this is the most difficult thing to decide will work for you. So you need to figure out what sort of tone you're going to use. Is it going to be the voice or the tone of a mature person, writing in a sophisticated style, filling your manuscript with impressive vocabulary items, using a very standard sentence structure that is subject, verb, object, not messing things around, not writing in disjointed sentences. So this is what you would expect if you are a mature writer or you're catering for a mature audience. But if you're writing for a younger audience, you're writing for teeny boppers or young adults, as they're called, you could use slang, you could use CompuSpeak, because they're so familiar with this digital language. You could use digital abbreviations. For example, if you used the word OBVS, OBS, they would know that it's obviously. A mature person might say, what? I've never heard of that word. What is it? But your younger audience would know. So your style and your choice of diction, as we call it, choice of words, will depend very much on your audience. And I will talk about audience in a bit. The next thing we talk about is your time sequence. This is so important in the telling of a story. And here again, you have three choices. The most common, the easiest, is chronological, where you start at the beginning and you work your way through the entire time in your life that you're recording, and then you stop right at the end. So this is logical. This is least complicated, and this is also most accessible for your reader. It doesn't ask your reader to have to work too hard in trying to figure out what's going on in the book. The second choice you have is that of the flashback, which is that you may start right at the end of the book and then go back to the beginning. That's a flashback, and then you tell your whole story after you've already revealed the end. This is interesting, but you must make sure then that your first chapter really grips your reader. It's got to be compelling, because then the reader is going to want to know, okay, so where did this whole story begin? And so the flashback's a good technique to use. And sometimes you can start in the middle of your story and then go to the beginning. You can then go to the end and then go to the middle and then go to the beginning. So that brings us to the third time sequence, the forward and backward time sequence. And this one is really the most complicated. This makes most demands on your reader, because your reader has to try to keep abreast of where you are in the story, and at what point you're shifting back, and at what point you're coming to the end of it. So it's not a bad thing to challenge your reader. You can certainly challenge your reader, but don't confuse your reader too much. Challenging is all right, confusion, no. Because if your reader is too confused, you will lose your reader. So if you're using the forward and backward movement, I would suggest you use it judiciously. Don't overdo it. Now we move on to the audience. That is so important. You must try to identify who you are writing for. Who is likely to be your reader, and who is likely to be the person most interested in your story. And you can do that demographically by thinking about your reader's likely age. Is it going to be a mature person? Is it going to be someone young? You can look at gender. Is it going to be likely male readers or female readers? Are they going to be highly educated or not? Are they going to be wealthy people or not? Are they going to be people who love adventure and travel, or are they going to be people who like to stay home and do things? So try to keep in mind, in fact, create in your mind's eye a sort of a composite image of whom your reader is. That would make your writing geared towards that reader and will not be too difficult to put together. So audience, very important. Then you must also try to identify your medium. Where is this going to be published eventually? Is it going to be a newspaper article? If so, you have a general reader. You're catering to people of a vast variety of demographic backgrounds. The difference with a newspaper article is that you have a very strict word limit. Your newspaper editor will have told you how long your piece can be, and you cannot exceed that. So that means you will have to try to make careful choices about what to include and what to leave out. So that's important. If you are writing for a specialized readership, for example, a college magazine, then of course your audience is limited to young people. They may have a desire for adventure or for excitement. You may be able to talk to them about a new sport you tried out, about the absolute fun you had bungee jumping, or the absolute horrific experience that zip lining was. Those are some of the things that you could put into a college magazine, because that's what would sell and that's what your readership would be interested in. The third choice, of course, is what most of us are using today, social media. We're using websites, we're using blogs, there's Facebook, there's Twitter, there's all sorts of social media outlets and a whole lot of others that I may not even be familiar with. So if you're writing for social media, then you know your readers, you know who your followers are, and you could you can cater for them, you can gear your writing for them. This is the forum in which you could do a lot of personal writing and a lot of personal revelations. You could talk about your personal experiences. You can also bring in your sentiments, your emotions. So this is where you can be as private or as open as you would choose, because this is the sort of forum in which you can really indulge yourself. And finally, we come to the book, the medium of the book, which is what mine was. This is the most extended of narrative forms. This can go all the way to 300 pages, double-spaced. It gives you much more freedom to be expansive and to talk a lot more about the things that are important to you or were important to you at that phase in your life. So the difference is that you may not know who will eventually be reading the book, because once it goes out into the wild blue yonder, it could go into anybody's hands. So to a certain extent, your readership remains vague if it is a book. All right, so let's go on to the next bit. So here is where I'm going to ask you to come in, just so that you can talk to me and you can talk to other people on this forum, and it's not just my voice you're hearing. This is the question of what should memoirs contain, or what should be in a memoir, or what would you put in a memoir? And I think, of course, the first thing you would put in is other people, because our memories are about other people. Other people make our memories. So a memoir is not supposed to be a quiet endeavor in which you sit down and you become philosophical and you do a whole lot of mind searching, etc. It's not really meant to be an activity that could be carried out alone. People want to read about other people, not just about you. So it is other people that will make or do make the fabric of our lives richer. And so our interactions with other people and the relationships we nurture with other people is really what will make your narrative. So at that point, I would like to say, if you're going to ask me, well, what sort of people? I will say this, that eccentric people make for the most absorbing reading. And the more eccentric the people you talk about or bring into your memoir, the more memorable it is. And I will share with you that when I circulated early drafts of my book to friends and to people who were aware that I was writing my memoir, I would ask them to come back to me with some of the feedback they could offer. And most of them told me that the accounts I gave of one-time encounters with people that I had never met before was for them the most interesting. So they loved my account of a menacing hitchhiker, for example, or a paranoid schizophrenic who latched onto me, or a belligerent tour guide in Northern Ireland. So they made a single appearance in the book and then they disappeared from the book again. But beyond a point in a memoir, people do not want to read about where you went and what you did there. They're more interested in the new friendships that you nurtured and the emotions that those relationships evoked in you. So I'm just going to take a little break at this point and ask people who've read my book or who are familiar with my manuscript, who were the people who were most memorable for you, and who do you remember most from having read the manuscript? And Christine, I'm going to leave you to moderate that, if you don't mind.
Yep, absolutely. So if you'd like to contribute, you can raise your hand. The way you can do that, there should be something at the bottom of your screen, an option to raise your hand. Let me just see if anybody's raising their hand. Okay, nobody's raising their hand. If anybody doesn't feel comfortable talking, you can certainly enter a question into the chat.
It's under participants.
Thank you. Yes, that is where it is. So yeah, if anybody wants to raise their hand, and if not, you can do the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. Just click the chat button.
Or if you prefer not to talk at all, that's also fine. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, so that's also fine.
I didn't read the book, but I'm going to order it from Amazon in about 10 minutes.
Oh, who is that?
Annie Reeves.
Oh, okay, Annie, that's great. I'm glad that at this point in the presentation itself, you feel tempted to do that. I'm glad, and I hope everyone else will. I was going to provide some sort of information about ordering the book right at the end, but that's terrific. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to go to my independent store.
That's great. Are they still open?
Curbside pickup. They are in Bethel, Connecticut, the Birds Books.
Oh, that's terrific. That's really
you can order online and have it delivered by post, or you can ask for curbside pickup. Bethel, Connecticut. It's fabulous.
Okay,
Bird
that's great.
Books,
That's
BYRD. Very independent, very small, very wonderful.
Excellent.
So Rochelle, you mentioned about the very daunting task about writing and rewriting to the end time.
Yes.
In the course of the discussion, I mean, over the next hour, you're going to be talking about the technical piece as to how does one do it? Is it through an app? Is it through an app? Because there must be some apps that would be accessible. Because I've just started looking with the pandemic. I've been looking at the possibility of a family memoir from 1850, and I'm just trying to figure out, how to technically get onto it.
Oh, that's a great question, but I'm afraid it's not one I can answer with any confidence. I just use Word. I always used Word.
Okay.
And then every time I edited, I did track changes.
Yeah.
And so I used a very basic editing software that is built into the Word program.
Okay.
And so every time I did track changes, then I was able to get rid of what I didn't want and sort of, bring it down to size. A lot of the rewriting was a result for me, in my case, of the people that I shared my manuscript with.
Yep.
And so they would make notes in the margin, or they would slash a whole passage, which meant to me that they said, delete this, not necessary.
Yep.
And then I would go back to my computer, go back on Word, and then just delete that bit.
Okay.
So I didn't use anything very sophisticated, I'm afraid. And if you're looking for a more sophisticated editing program or application, I bet they are out there. But I have always just used Word, and I've done all my books using Word.
Okay,
so I'm afraid I can't give you any more information than that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Karishma,
did you have your hand raised?
I have a quick question. In the beginning, I'm not that familiar with memoir writing, and you had mentioned something about fictional memoir. What would a fictional memoir look like, considering that most memoirs are about people's actual experiences? Is it that you just change the names and keep people anonymous? Is that?
Yes, that for me was the biggest part of the fictional element in my memoir. That is, I changed names because I wanted to maintain people's privacy, and I didn't want to violate it. And I wanted to make sure that I gave them the anonymity that they deserved. But in the next bit, when I'm going to talk about experiences and anecdotes, I'm going to say that that's the place where you can embellish. In an anecdote, you can embellish, you can exaggerate if you want to make your situation or to make your experience more dramatic. So you could do that. To that extent, that was what I meant by fictional. But it was mainly changing the names of places or changing the names of people that make my account fictional.
Okay. And that would be very different from, say, if you've written a novel which is inspired. Like I've written a novel. It's taken me, you could say, about 13 to 14 years to write it, and I'm finally finished, finally. And like you were talking about before, where you would put your manuscript down and wouldn't look at it for 2 years, and then pick it up again and then go back to it. I had the same experience. And I, after having like 3 kids and going back to school and then going back to work, and I had all these gaps where my writing was put aside. So I would look back and I would see how I've grown as a person and as a mature writer in 2-3 years, to look what I wrote 3 years ago. Oh, said no, and then changed that, and then went forward. And so in that case, I'm guessing it's not a memoir, because even though it's so inspired by my own life, there are many things, events, and experiences, or you can say, and people in the novel, in the book, that are actually not real.
Yeah. So in that case, if a very large part of the book is made up and didn't really actually happen, it would be fiction. The fact is that all fiction is inspired by something we've lived through or something we've experienced, almost invariably. It's very unusual that you would write about something you don't know at all. The first rule of fiction is, write what you know about. So it sounds to me, from what you're saying, that you are in the area of fiction, even though your characters and your plot, etc., or your subplots are inspired by the things that actually happened to you.
Okay.
And I should tell everyone that Karishma was my student at NYU, I think about 15 years ago. So
long time ago.
So delighted to see her here after ages.
It's so nice to see you after so long. It's really
it's so great. And she was one of my my better students. I tell you, I've never forgotten Karishma, because she was such an unforgettable student. So so if there's any way that I can help, Karishma, if I can read your chapters or if I can look at your drafts, I'll be more than happy to do that. So please just feel free to email them to me, and I'll be happy
I would
to.
love that. I would love that. Thank you so
terrific.
much.
And do that. Reach out to other readers and reach out to other people, because the kind of feedback that you get from informally sending your chapters around is just invaluable. So don't shy away from doing that.
Okay.
If you need to shy away from anybody, I think it is your closest family members, because one is always afraid of their criticism. So you might want to show it to friends rather than to immediate family members.
That's a great idea, since my husband is like the biggest critic of all.
Exactly. So we'll move on now to places. That's the next item
Rochelle,
on my.
we have one more.
Sorry. Is there somebody else? Sorry.
We have one more hand from Alicia.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Rochelle.
Who is
Going back
that?
to even old, Preeti, Alicia.
Oh, hi. How are you? Hi. This is about one of my former students from India, from Bombay.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions on memoir writing. Do you believe that one should leave memoir writing when you're a little older to give it that edge of life experience?
Not necessarily. I think it will all depend on what it is that you're saying in your memoir. For example, if you're, as I said right at the very beginning, if you're writing a memoir about a childhood that was unique or different, maybe because it was a foster childhood in some place, or you could write that when you were in your 20s, because you're looking back on that phase in your life. If you're going to write it all depends on which stage of your life you're in and which stage of your life you're recounting. In my experience, waiting for a while and then writing much later will definitely give you, as Karishma said, the wisdom of experience, because by the older you grow, the more you are likely to have written. And so it would give you the wisdom of experience, and it would make your writing probably that much easier. But I don't personally believe that you need to wait. I would say that you would need to wait if you're writing an autobiography, because then an autobiography is a story of a lifetime. So that sort of thing I would like to read when you have kind of lived the bulk of your life. I wouldn't like to read an autobiography of somebody who's 15 or 16 or 20 years old. So, but if you're writing a memoir based on a phase in your life, a part of your life, or based on someone who came into your life for a particular period, then you don't necessarily, I think, need to wait too long.
Okay. So another question I have is essentially, how does one know that their life is interesting enough? Their journey is interesting enough, their struggle is interesting enough. Because as a writer, I know one thing, that blowing your own trumpet is the hardest part of being sold, right? There's a commercial aspect to writing.
Yeah.
So how does one know that their struggle or their journey is worthwhile enough to pen down and for others to read?
Okay, I think that's a terrific question. Number one, you have to believe that what you have to say out there is interesting to yourself. If you don't think it's interesting yourself, why would somebody else find it interesting? So you've got to be convinced that what you're writing about is interesting, is different, is compelling. If you don't feel that yourself, if you don't know in your own bones that this is something that I think is very interesting, and hopefully somebody else will, then don't bother. So obviously you have to find that it is interesting, or that it is engaging. You've got to feel that yourself. Once you do decide that what you have to say is interesting, then the selling of it is a whole different exercise. That's a marketing exercise. And at that point, you can't hold back. At that point, you can't feel, there's no room for modesty there, because you're competing with a bunch of people out there who are all trying to grab the attention of that agent or of that publisher. So at that point, there is no room for feeling shy or whatever. Then you've got to go out there and not be afraid to say that it's the best book that has ever been written on the planet. Then you've got to really push it. That's my opinion. You really have to be aggressive about selling your wares in a competitive market.
So basically, let me put it this way. What I've gathered is, this is probably for those, especially the gentleman who asked about writing programs. Can I chip in and offer a little advice on what he could use? Because I use writing programs for my writing. So Is that okay for me to just tell him what
Oh,
I've
yes,
been using
please,
beyond words?
yes, please do,
Yeah.
because I wouldn't
Okay.
be able to. So
Okay. So essentially, I use a Mac, so I use Scrivener, which is a one-time pay. It is an extremely good program, a bit complicated, but extremely. I find it wonderful. It keeps my work in place, and I believe Ulysses is another one which is very good. That is more payment regularly. I prefer Scrivener. Firstly, it's one-time payment, and second, it works beautifully on a Mac. Hemingway for basic style. It's not that high end, but at least it gives you it's a thing of interest. It tells you whether the paragraph you've written or the chapter you've written is interesting enough or whatever it is. So I find these handy. I've used them for all three books, and I feel that Scrivener has been a real boon. It's worth trying, and I think they have free trials and everything as well. So just one more thing, Rochelle, would it be right if I said that if you're writing a memoir, not only should it be interesting, but it should also contribute to somebody's life as in leading by example?
not necessarily, no.
Okay.
Not necessarily. It should help somebody understand a little bit more about our world and about life. Not necessarily that they would then do exactly what you're doing or feel inspired to do what you're doing. No, it doesn't have to be I walked in these shoes first, so I'm expecting you to do the same. But no, but you can talk to them about what you did and enhance their understanding of a little part of our world or of life in general. It doesn't have to be something that they would follow suit with.
Can you throw in philosophy? Sorry.
And Alicia, I missed the first app that you mentioned. I didn't quite hear it.
Scrivener, Scrivener.
Sorry, SER?
Scrivener. Scrivener.
Okay.
I use that, so I'm quite happy with it. It works out more reasonable since it's a one-time cost. I've not used Ulysses, but it is between these two writing programs.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I hope it
helps. Rochelle,
yes,
one of the very captivating pieces of your memoir was the use of conversations in your memoir, and that sort of was very gripping and added another aspect of another layer of the experience. What advice would you have for us on including conversations in the memoir?
Thank you, Laureen. That's going to be a part of my a part of what I've got right up on the screen right now. What should memoirs contain? When I talk about experiences and anecdotes, I do talk about bringing in dialogue and bringing in conversation, because that's critical, like you said. And at that point in time, let me get down to it and talk to you about how you would incorporate dialogue or conversation into your book. It's very important to do that. Go ahead, I can't hear you.
Oh, hold on. Sorry, I accidentally muted everyone. Let me go back.
Okay, when you do your edits,
yeah,
do you keep generations of edits that you can go back to something?
Yes. And so I number them. Mine is all very, very simply done. It's nothing complicated. So I just edit them. It would be first chapter, and into brackets, I'd say 1, first chapter, number 2. So I know this is the second, third, fourth edit of the first chapter. Yes, just very simply done. As I said, I don't use complicated software, but I'm sure if you did, there might be an easier way to do all this. For me, this has worked.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So let's go on now. We're talking about places. The next thing that I think after people, the next important thing is places. Places should figure in a memoir, because nothing happens to you in life in a vacuum. It always happens in some kind of location. So our memories are always associated with places or with locations. So for example, where were you when you ate your first snail, for instance? Or where were you when you sipped your first mojito? I think that would be important. Which part of the world? Were you in a bar, or were you in someone's house? Okay, where were you when you thumbed a lift for the first time? Or where were you when you gave someone a lift for the first time? It's things like that bring location into it. Where were you when you forced yourself to get out of your comfort zone and to do something out of whack with the person you normally are? Like diving from the topmost diving board, or skinny dipping, for example, or going on a date wearing false eyelashes, or spending a night alone in a haunted house. These are some of the things that, or some of the anecdotes or experiences that are enhanced by your reference to the place in which it occurred, because the place will then monitor your experience. So it's important to talk about place. Now we come to experiences and anecdotes. So this is where I think you have to ask yourself the question, Preeti, to go back to your question, how do I know that this is important, or how do I know this is of interest? I guess you have to ask yourself the question, how is my experience different? Or what makes my experience different from everybody else's? So there are so many experiences I could give of writers who have made wonderful memoirs, have had best-selling memoirs based on interesting experiences that were unique and that were different from everybody else's. For example, Bill Bryson wrote a whole memoir on walking the entire Appalachian Trail, and he called it A Walk in the Woods. Julia Child wrote a memoir about joining a cordon bleu school in Paris, and she called it My Life in France. And then Julie Powell took that book and took a book and one of Julia Child's books, and decided she was going to cook every single recipe in the book. And she wrote her memoir called Julie and Julia. So these are fun, charming memoirs that are based on quite extraordinary and different experiences that people had or put themselves through. But you can also have very dark memoirs. You can have memoirs that are disturbing, or memoirs that frighten, or that sort of keep you on edge. And one of the memoirs that comes to my mind was Amanda Lindhout and Sarah Corbett's book that I read a few years ago. I think it was a one book, one town book here in Fairfield. It was called A House in the Sky. And this was based on the experiences of these two women who were abducted, two American women who were abducted in Somalia. They were journalists, and they were kept imprisoned for 15 months, where they were continually, this one girl managed to escape, but Amanda Lindhout stayed through it all, was continuously raped for 15 months. And the whole book was just the memoir based on those 15 months. Terribly, terribly dark and very disturbing. But then that was her unique experience, and that was why she thought her book was, her memoir was likely to sell. Now, my book was based on spending a year in London and traveling all over Europe. So what was the USP? There has to be a USP, a unique selling proposition, in my experience, that would make it different from everybody else's. Now, imagine if I went and said to a publisher, or to an agent, I'm writing a book about spending a year in London. They would have said, yeah, right, yawn, yawn. How many people have written a book like that? We're not interested. But then, as it turned out, I happened to come back home, and I ran into a friend of mine in Southport Village. And she asked me how my year went. And I said, oh, it was great. And she asked me, what did you do? And I said, you know, I spent a while traveling, and I stayed in these youth hostels everywhere. Now, mind you, I turned 50 that year. So this was going to be, as I said, my gap year at 50. And so she threw her head back and she laughed and she said, you stayed in youth hostels everywhere? And I said, yes, I did. And she said, you know, I'd love to read a book about that. And there was it. There I got my USP, my unique selling proposition was right there in front of me. So a lot of women at the age of 50 have traveled solo or gone to some part of the world alone. Fine. A lot of young people have lived in youth hostels and have written memoirs, have written books about that. But when you marry the two together and you take a 50-year-old woman who is spending time in youth hostels and staying, rubbing shoulders with these wacko women and wacko men in mixed gender dorms, etc., then there you have it. There you have a book that is going to sell, and your publisher would be interested in a book like that. So that's your USP. You have to find your USP and decide what makes your experience different from anybody else's. Once you've found that, then you need to make it anecdotal. So it's got to be filled with anecdotes, filled with encounters of people you met, memorable meals you ate, unexplored corners that you sort of took a foray into. You've got to talk about very unfamiliar experiences that you were exploring for the first time. I talk about going to a restaurant in Belgium and trying an unfamiliar stew because a couple in Belgium suggested it. I talk about going to a famous London restaurant that had every Michelin star you can imagine. And I had a terrible experience there. And I said, oh, it was just the opposite of what I expected. I talk about a stranger who latched onto me and told me to be his museum guide in a museum. What are the odds of that happening to anyone? So that was anecdotal and different. And then I talked about a museum guide in Oslo in Norway who broke every rule when he took me into the museum when it was officially closed, when he saw how shattered I was that the museum was closed and I couldn't get in. So these are anecdotes, and you weave all of them together, and they're what's going to flesh out your memoir and give it heft. Now we come to the question of dialogue, this great question that Laureen asked me. So anecdotes must be brought to life with dialogue. You have to be speaking to someone. You have to bring that other person you're talking about to life by giving that person a voice. And the best way to do that is to try to remember what was the tenor of your conversation at that time. You may not remember every word, but you would remember the general tone of it. You can always make things up because you're not likely to remember every sentence that was uttered between the two of you, and that's fine. You can make things up. You can try to remember the persona of this individual and find words to put into this person's mouth that would suit that persona. So there has to be a correlation between the words that are coming out of the person's mouth, let's call that person your character, and the person itself. So that's where dialogue comes in, and dialogue is important. Dialogue will flesh out your book. And dialogue is where you can also bring humor. So I was going to say that humor is important. In addition to that, description is very important. Describe when you're talking, when you're giving an anecdote, talk about the scene. Talk about your expression of feelings. What were you feeling at the time? So don't rely on pure narrative alone. That can get very, very boring. Always include conversation. Always bring in a visual detail or an impression of the place where the encounter occurred. So flesh it out. You need to give a description and detail, which is the next thing I'm coming to. They tell you in fiction, one of the rules of fiction is show, don't tell. But I think that in memoir writing, you've got to show and tell. And I think that's the big difference in writing a memoir and writing a novel. Now we come to humor. Humor doesn't hurt. And in your experiences and anecdotes, humor must play a very big role. You can make your memoir funny and your reader is hooked. That's it. Readers of my book, when discussing it with me, when looking at chapters, kept telling me all the time about what made them laugh. And that's when I realized that humor is what stays with the reader. Now, I don't think of myself in normal life as being a funny person. I'm not the sort of person who tells jokes, makes people laugh. I'm not the sort of person who comes up with witty rejoinders or a terrific repartee. I always admire people who can do that, but I don't have that talent. So I had to work on the humor in my book because I realized that that was going to leave a lasting impression. And I'm very glad I did, because people have been telling me time and time again how hilarious this book was, how funny it was, that they were laughing out loud when reading it on trains, etc. So at the end, I realized that humor really worked, and I would very strongly suggest that in a memoir, you bring in humor. We're now going on to description and detail. A memoir thrives on both description and detail. Remember, your reader has not traveled to the places that you're writing about. Your reader has not participated in the events that you are recounting. So you need to be the eyes, the ears, the nose, and the palate of your reader. Don't hesitate to give visual detail, oral detail, olfactory detail, gastronomic detail. You must really provide the ability for your reader to see the scene clearly, to listen to the sounds that you heard at the time, to smell the aromas and the fragrances of that entire scenario, and to taste the delicacies. So all of this is powerful through, all of this is made powerful through description. And what makes description powerful? Obviously, detail, right? There's this wonderful quote that everybody gives you all the time from the architect Mies van der Rohe, who said, "God is in the details." And I really couldn't argue with that. God is truly in the details. So if you're describing a sunset, don't just say that the sun was a golden orb in the sky. That's one aspect of it. But go one step further. That's a description. Now go one step further and give detail. Now talk about the aquamarine and coral clouds that cushioned that orb in the sky. So now you've gone one step further and you've given detail. And make the scene as graphic and as immediate as you can, because you want to make that experience real. One of the other aspects of writing a memoir is digressions. So what do I mean by digressions and what are they? So digressions are nuggets of information that you provide to enhance your reader's understanding of a situation that you're describing. So for example, take Bill Bryson's book, his travel memoir on traveling in Australia called In a Sunburned Country. He spends the first 50 or 60 pages of the book talking about all the natural hazards that could kill you in Australia. He talks about creatures on land and creatures in the sea, from poisonous snakes to poisonous jellyfish. And here he begins his book with this sort of information. So it's not really a digression. He will come to these creatures later in the book, and they will serve as his digressions later on. But he provided the reader with a lot of extraneous information even before his memoir began. And that's important. Fill your reader in with information that's about the place. For example, I was writing in my book, or I wrote in my book, about almost getting arrested in London during a ceremony called the Trooping of the Colour, when I was trying to find my spot that would enable me to get a good view of a royal procession that was in front of me. And so then I realized, okay, if my readers are American, they're probably not going to know what the ceremony of the Trooping of the Colors is. So I should tell them a little bit about that. So that became my digression. You know, I provided historic detail. Where did this ceremony originate? Who participates in it? Where does it take place? Who are the spectators? And by doing that, I threw at them some tidbits of typical British culture that they might not have known. And I provided a digression. I moved away from the me, and I talked about something that had to do with the country and the culture. So digressions are important. But remember, we come now to the sixth element. In order to provide digressions that are accurate and that are real, you need to do your research. So you've got to either talk to the local people and ask them, you know, what exactly is this procession? What does this mean? What sort of a parade is this? Or Google it. Now we have Wikipedia that can answer all our questions. If you're writing about Japan, for instance, you might want to write about onsen, the hot springs, and the soaking in hot springs that's a part of Japanese culture. Where did that custom originate? From volcanic springs that were created by excessive seismic activity. So if you're writing about the ban on beef eating in India, for example, you might want to say why and provide the research. That's research. It's because the cow is the sacred animal to the Hindus, which is who are the dominant people in India. So this is what I mean by doing your research and providing digressions that are based on research. So that's also very, very important. Now we come to a really important aspect of memoir writing that a lot of people don't think is important because it's a memoir, but in fact it's as important as it would be in novel writing or fiction writing. And that's what we call creating narrative continuity. And the way you create narrative continuity is by constructing narrative arcs. And these are very important. So I want you to imagine or visualize an arc that is going across the sky like a rainbow, starting at one point on the left and then moving across and culminating at a point on the right. This is what I mean by an arc. And as long as you have that visual in front of you, you should be able to create these narrative arcs, because as in fiction, so too in nonfiction, you need to create a sense of continuity that will take the reader from the beginning of the book to the end and logically allow the reader to progress from one chapter to the other or one page to the other. That's very, very important. So that the reader needs to feel that this is not just a disjointed patchwork of anecdotes or experiences, but that there is some kind of a connecting arc that brings it all together and that keeps the book sort of coherent. So those can take several forms. A project that you're involved in that can keep you going right through the book. My project was my research on Anglo-Indians. So I started to tell the readers right in the beginning what I was doing in the UK, what my project with Anglo-Indians was. And then I walked them through the people I met in that connection or the libraries that I used in order to do my research. And then at the end of the day, they realized that my research was complete and I was ready to leave London having accomplished my task. You can also talk about a challenge, which is something that you may have had to deal with through the entire span of time. So in my case, it was getting plantar fasciitis. This was a foot ailment, really painful. This happened to me almost at the beginning of my stay in London, and it gave me the opportunity to talk and bring in all sorts of digressions. So I was able to talk about the doctors, the hospitals, the physiotherapists, the podiatrists that I saw in the process of trying to bring myself some relief from the pain. It also allowed me to digress and talk about socialized medicine and the healthcare service in the UK, that is the National Health Service. It talks about how I coped with this condition, about the weird remedies that people told me about and how religiously I tried them all because I was so desperate to save myself from the pain. So all that challenge of continuing with my work and continuing with my goals and not giving up, despite having this excruciating pain, created that sort of challenge that I think made a nice arc. The other thing that you could do is have a quest. You're starting, you have a desire to find something. So you begin somewhere and at the end, you may or may not have found it. In my case, it was my friend in London who arrived there from the US and said she was hoping to meet Mr. Right. So the entire book is also a matter of trying to help her find the right person because she enlists my services in helping her to find a right partner. So we talk about the men she starts dating, how those dates went. We talk about her experiences with these people. And eventually, I'm not going to tell you whether she found Mr. Right or not. You're going to find out when you read the book. But that was another arc that was humorous because there was some humor to it, to the people she met and how she, interacted with them. You could also have a problem and then talk about how that problem was resolved. So that creates an arc. For me, it was suddenly finding myself homeless and having to leave my darling flat and my lovely neighbors in Holborn, and then having to find alternative accommodation somewhere else. And so that problem becomes an arc when I talk about the people I met who offered me alternatives, the accommodation I went to check out, the friend who suddenly came from out of nowhere and offered me her pied-à-terre in London and said I could stay there, and then what sort of a place that turned out to be. So that was a whole arc that I exploited in the book. So those arcs are very important because they are what will connect all the disparate aspects of your book and knit them together. You can also create narrative continuity and create an arc through characters, through people. So this could be family members. And so early in the book, I talk about my husband, for example, who comes into London to settle me down. Then he arrives at different points in my year. So we travel together. And so he keeps recurring. I talk about my daughter in the beginning of the book, and then she comes to London. And then there's a whole chapter on us being together there. You can talk about friends. I talk about the friends that I knew before I arrived in London and the role that they played during my year. Neighbors who are the new people that you meet in this new place and who turned out to be wonderful friends and are still friends. So you talk about how these neighbors then take you under their wing, give you advice, offer company on long walks. They offer you, or you have delicious meals with them. So that also creates continuity and takes you through the arc. Eventually, you can talk about strangers who became good friends. And I had several of those encounters in London, people I didn't know at all, people I met for the first time. They became very good friends. For example, I talk about a bishop and his wife and their family who became my surrogate family in London and provided me with an alternative family there when I was alone without my family. So these are the sort of people that you can bring in, and these are the sort of aspects that give you your arc, and that narrative arc is important. Now, at this point in time, I would like to say beware, and I'd like to offer a disclaimer, and I'd like to say two things very, very important. One is that you must, in a memoir, beware of disclosing too much personal information. It's not a novel. In fiction, you can always disguise characters, or you can always say that you made something up. But in a memoir, you are disclosing things that actually happened to you. You may be hesitant about introducing certain aspects of your personal life. And if you're hesitant, then don't bring them in. It's very important that you feel comfortable about what you write in a memoir, because remember, it is ultimately going to be published. It's going to be in the hands of unknown readers, and you don't know what they're going to make of your life. So you've got to feel 100% comfortable about what you're putting out there in a memoir. And if you feel the slightest twinge of unease, then don't put a certain element into it. It's very important to remember that a memoir does not have to be a tell-all. It is okay to keep the reader guessing. It is okay to keep the reader wondering. It is much better to do that than to have to humiliate yourself, demean yourself, degrade yourself, or embarrass yourself. So be very careful about what you put into a memoir and what you hold back, because there's no taking it back once it's out there and once it's in print. You don't want to backtrack. And the second thing I would say, be very careful about violating someone else's privacy, because your book is not just about yourself. If you're bringing other people into the book, then you also have to be very careful about how you are representing them. And if you are worried about your feelings of unease, or you're worried about humiliating yourself, demeaning yourself, embarrassing yourself, then be doubly conscious about the fact that you could be demeaning or embarrassing or humiliating somebody else. And you don't want to do that, because relationships are precious, and you don't want to cause any ill will among people that you love or people that mean something to you, and you don't want to actually afterwards have to explain yourself. So just be very careful of violating somebody else's privacy. Don't reveal things about them that you think they would not want the world to know. A good idea might be, if you're talking about somebody else and you have to make difficult decisions, just send them the chapter or send them the portion and say, I'd like you to read this chapter and tell me if you're okay with it, because this chapter is about you. And if there's any bits of this chapter that make you feel uncomfortable, let me know, and I'll take those bits off. And it's perfectly fine to do that. In fact, it's advisable to do that, because you don't want to have to explain yourself or apologize for anything that you've put in. It's much better to be cautious at the very beginning. Okay, so now let's assume that your manuscript is all set and you think that most of it or the bulk of it is written. Now you need to workshop it, and a workshop group is really sort of like joining a creative writing program. If you're not able to actually take a creative writing class, then a workshop group is a great way to start sharing your work with people and to get feedback and to find out how you can revise or what you can do to edit it. And so, like I just said, I offered to read Karishma's chapters, and I'll be happy to do that. So try to find people who will, whose work or whose opinion you value, and who you think would look at your work judiciously and not be afraid to speak up and tell you where you could make changes. So meet with a group, bring your writing along, exchange it with a partner while you are at the group event, then read through each other's work. That was what today's workshop was going to be about. That was going to be our format initially, but that was when we were going to do it in the library. Then you spend 10 minutes talking about it. You offer feedback. You find out what are the positive and the negative aspects of this writing. Then you go back to your essay. You carry out changes if you agree. And that's critical. If you agree, after all, it is your work, and 5 people will tell you 5 different things. So you have to make your own decisions about how you want to progress. And then finally, you review your revised essay, and then you can show it to somebody else again. So you can show it to a number of groups or a number of people. You can also seek an individual reader for your group. For your work. It doesn't necessarily have to be a workshopping group. You can show it to a friend or a colleague or a relative and do the same thing. Find friends whose opinions you care about and whom you trust. Give them your chapters. Set up dates to discuss your writing. Take notes or have them make notes for you. Go back, carry out changes only if you agree. Then review your revised chapter and then again repeat. So it just doesn't stop there. You keep going until you feel completely convinced that there is not another word or sentence or line you can change to make it better. You've got to feel, okay, this is just the best that I can come up with. Now we come to marketing your memoir and trying to find a publisher. Now there are tons of wonderful books in the library. When the Pequot Library opens, you can go there and find wonderful books on how to find a publisher, and any local library has all sorts of books about finding publishers. So I won't go into the details. There's whole books written on it, but I will say if it's a memoir and it's going to be a book, then don't keep it more than 300 double-spaced pages, because the length is very important and publishers will reject if it is too long, and it makes the book expensive to produce, it makes the book heavier, it just is not feasible. So keep your length in mind. Avoid pictures much as you would like to have them. A lot of my friends who read the book said they kept looking for pictures and they were very disappointed to find none. Pictures make the production of a book much more expensive. So publishers will avoid that. They will say, no, we can't do these pictures. They just make the book bulky and expensive. So my publisher suggested we do just one picture and we put that picture on the cover. And that's how my picture came on the cover of the book. And it's really worked because people have told me that it is such a good representation of everything that I say goes on in the book. Use all your personal contacts to either find an agent or to find a publisher. Now, if you're looking to publish with big name publishers, then you would need an agent. And there are agents that specialize in marketing and selling your memoirs. If you're looking for a smaller publisher, second tier or third tier, you don't need an agent. You can go directly to the acquisition editors in the different publishing houses and contact them directly. Usually having a personal contact helps. So if you know a friend who has a contact to a publisher, ask them if they can take your manuscript over and speak up for you and see whether that will give you your foot in. But the most important thing that you have to do is write a really terrific query letter. And the query letter and how to write, the query letter is your introduction. You are introducing yourself to your publisher. Again, there are books that teach you how to write a query letter, what a query letter should contain, etc. I would tell you in a nutshell, you need to identify what your unique selling proposition is, your USP, and then push that USP right through that query letter. So start off in the first paragraph itself, saying what makes your book unique or what makes your book different from everybody else, and then keep on through that letter, which shouldn't be more than a page, by the way, to tell them why your book is important and why your book should be published by them. You also need to use Writer's Market to identify publishers or agents that deal with your particular type of writing, which is first-person non-fictional memoirs or first-person fictional memoirs. And once you find the publisher that deals with your particular type of niche writing, it's easier for them to accept it. Take advice from the publisher, because your publisher will if you meet with rejection, for example, and a publisher says, no, they're not interested, and you will meet with rejection, believe me, ask the publisher what you could do differently that would have made them interested in your book. Take their advice, because publishers will give you terrific advice. They may say, you know, this manuscript is much too long. You just have to cut it down to size, and then I'd have been interested. But at 400 pages, no. Or as one publisher told me, you need to make it more edgy. And I didn't even know what that meant. But then when I looked into what they meant by edgy, I saw, okay, that's what they mean. And then they really needed it not to be a straight narrative, but they needed it to be sort of on the edge. And so I did that. They may talk about changing the narrative pattern, chronological from the beginning, going to the end, boring. And I must tell you that my first chapter, which everybody just raves about and says it was just the best first chapter, was actually my 5th chapter. But somebody who read the book told me that 5th chapter was the best chapter in the book and I should make it the first chapter. And they said, put that in, make that your first chapter, and then let the rest of the book be a flashback. And I took their advice. So do keep yourself open to the advice of publishers or agents or people, friends that you trust. And keep on working on it. Don't think that once you've written it, that's it, you can't make any changes. You've got to do the changes. And I would say keep plugging on, even if you meet with rejection, because after all, it is a numbers game. And remember that all you need is one person to come up and say, I love the manuscript and I would like to publish it. And that's it. That's all you need, that one person, and then your book comes out. So finally, I would say, I have a few notes of advice, and my notes of advice are: learn to take constructive criticism well. Don't feel hesitant to take criticism. Don't take it personally. Don't feel hurt if somebody doesn't say to you, oh, I love the book. You are there to progress as a writer and to get better and better, and to make sure that your final product is the best that it can possibly be. And the second thing I would say is practice, practice, practice. And what does that mean? It simply means that you write and then you revise, and then you write and you revise. So it goes on endlessly, and you will never stop until one day you look at your manuscript and you say, I cannot make it any better than it is now. This is going to be my final product. This is what I'm going to go with. And then eventually, even though you cannot quite believe it, one fine day you will be holding your book in your hand and you will have your memoir all done, just like this. Ta-da! And it's done. So I hope that this has been of help to you. I'm only going to say good luck and happy writing. And I think we are bang on time as far as my timing is concerned. So I'm going to be most happy to take questions. And Christine, if you'd like to moderate that again, I'll be happy to take questions. I hope this was helpful to you people. And once again, I'm going to say my book is available on Amazon, or if you have a local bookseller that would stock it, then please. It's called The Year the World Was Mine, and Anglophile Hits a Half Century.
So thanks, Rochelle. Thank you so much. So we did have 2 questions that came up during the presentation. The first one comes from Edwin, and he's asking if all writers generally share their material with trusted peers.
He's asking if all writers do that?
Yes, if generally speaking.
Yes, almost all the writers I know do that, because the writers they work in isolation. We produce our work in isolation. Writing is a very solitary activity. So you will sit somewhere very quietly for hours and hours and hours, days and days and days writing. But once you have a product, almost all the people I know share their work around, workshop it, either join a workshopping group or pass it around. At NYU, we are a group of colleagues who show each other our scholarly articles, our scholarly pieces of writing, and something that you do because that's how you get the best feedback to make it better. So almost all the writers I know do that. And now if there are some writers, I guess if you are you've reached the heights of somebody like Salman Rushdie and you have won the Booker of Bookers, maybe you wouldn't do that. But I think that most writers, or a lot of writers, do.
Rochelle, there is something, I don't know whether the US has it, but in India, to protect my work, I register it.
Yes,
I register
yes, we do have that.
I register my copyright. Yeah. And then I think it's a lot easier. And I believe that if you use email to send the book to whoever you need to, because that protects and gives you proof that you sent it to somebody. So no physical hard copies. I mean, that's how you protect your work, basically. So I, at every level, when I start with a synopsis, I register the work, and then I go to the main book and I register that as well. So maybe if you all can just find out what you have.
Yes, we do have that. We do have that, and you can get your book copyrighted. You can get your manuscript copyrighted. Yes, and you know what? There's lots of books, as I said, that are already here on our shelves that will give or take writers through the whole process of doing that. Yes.
And another thing when you spoke about publishing, well, I have done, I've just landed a good contract with a big 5 publisher. The reason that has happened, and I believe that from my last book to this one, is that I got a literary agent. What you said is get one, and you're absolutely right, because there was no way I was going to get a look into that. So I think the first thing for anyone who wants to get published is to get that literary agent and be happy to share that commission with them, because you're not going to get a look in.
True.
It's very important in my opinion.
I would agree with you. But it's not to say that you can't get a book out without an agent either. You could.
Yeah.
As you say, your first book came out without an agent, may not have been the best publisher. But if you don't want to go that route, or if you can't find an agent, you can also go directly through the publisher.
Yeah, sure. I agree.
Okay.
Karishma?
Yes. So my question was also copyright related, and so for someone like me who's finished a book, and I was in the process of thinking of getting it copyrighted, but then is it worth getting it copyrighted before you're done editing? Like, even though I've edited it a lot, I feel like I still need to edit it more. So at what point should you copyright before you look for an agent? And the other thing is how to even find an agent, because I don't think it's easy to get one.
Yeah. So the first question about copywriting, my suggestion to you is finish or be completely satisfied that this is the best that you could produce and that you're not going to continue with more edits, and then get it copyrighted. So copyright a piece of a manuscript that is as complete as possible in your opinion. Okay. And if you still think you're looking at it and you're going to edit it because you're not completely satisfied with it, then don't copyright. Wait, hang on.
Okay.
As regards, and of course, when it comes to sharing your work, for example, share your work with people whom you can trust, who are not going to plagiarize or take your ideas. So at that point, you don't need to copyright if you're using people that you know or trust. That's important.
Right.
As regards your second question, which is how do you find an agent? You go through Writer's Market. Writer's Market has, get the current edition. There is a new Writer's Market, a new edition that comes out every year. Get the current edition of Writer's Market, and there will be a whole list of agents that cater to a particular type of genre of writing. So you will see non-fictional memoirs or fictional memoirs will be in a whole category by itself with a number of agents. After that, Karishma, it's a lot of luck. It's the luck of the draw, really. It's how good your query letter is. It's how timely your work is, whether that agent is looking at that point in time for a manuscript to come along that fills this particular void that they have in their list, because every agent has a list for the year. So it is very difficult, there's no doubt about it, which is why oftentimes people get so frustrated trying to find an agent that they go directly to a publisher and they say, it's okay if it's not one of the big publishers, I will go with a smaller publisher, but I want to see my book out because I don't want to be part of this trying to find an agent rat race. So it's up to you. It's your decision. I would say that Preeti is right when she says finding an agent means that you're likely to get a bigger name. And the question of sharing the commission with the publisher, that with the agent, that's fine. That's standard. But the question is, you might not get an agent, and in that case, what do you do? So then you go out on your own.
Right. And I have another quick question. There's a lot of people who are self-publishing these days. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm not going to knock it, but I would say that should be your last resort.
Okay.
It's much better to try to find an agent. If you don't succeed, go directly through an acquisition editor in a publishing house. And if you don't succeed, but you feel very strongly about getting your work out there, then go the self-publishing route. But the self-publishing route tends not to be the most coveted way, because it doesn't really make you eligible to enter the awards and the prizes, etc., literary prizes. You can't enter when it is self-published, generally speaking. So having a publisher that will actually speak to your work is a very good thing, because it means that it was refereed, it was peer refereed. People thought that it was a good work. It was sent to other people to act in scholarly publication. They send it to scholars to read the work and to referee it and make sure it was okay. So having a publisher gives a work validity. And again, I don't want to knock it, and I don't want to say that, hey, you shouldn't self-publish, because a lot of people are doing that now. I'm aware of that.
Right. Okay.
I think
Thank
the problem you'll face, Karishma, is
Yes.
of marketing and distribution.
If you
I
self-publish,
have, yeah, I actually went with an experiment where I self-published my first one, which was only 40 pages. And I realized, okay, you get some money, but basically, I mean, it's only 40 pages, so it was not intended for anything else. And with the experiment, I would suggest that you avoid self-publishing. Firstly, it does not give you, as she said, the validation.
right.
You'll definitely not get a look into it. And the marketing and distribution is really difficult.
Okay.
So traditional is the best way to go. And if you want the big boys and the literary agent takes you, you probably will get the big boys.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Rochelle, I have a question. This is Pamela Flesher. Can you just take a moment and tell us, how did you decide on your title, and how do you go about titling your memoir?
How do I go about what, my memoir, sorry?
Placing the title of your memoir. How did you do that?
Right. Yeah, I got that. What was the second part of your question?
You didn't really make reference to it as you talked about the different parts of writing the memoir.
Right.
So I just wanted to make sure that I could touch on that before we lost you.
Okay, good. So I played around with a whole bunch of titles. I thought about all sorts of things. One of the things that I thought I was very clever and that would work was a title called Smitten by Britain. I love that. But then I realized that a lot of my book was not about Britain, but it was about other parts of Europe that I had traveled to, as well as India, because I did go to Bombay for a bit during that year. So then I decided I had to take the Britain out of it, because my book is much more than Britain itself. And so I started to play around, and I thought in some way or the other I should bring out the fact that I am an Anglophile, and I'm very proud of that. I should bring in some way that I was 50 that year, and that this is a memoir about my 50th year. It was sort of me marking that year. And then I realized that I had done so much of traveling that year that the whole world was open to me during that 1 year. So I tried to combine all those elements together, and then thought that it would be best to have a title and then to have a subtitle, because then only I could say all the things I wanted to say. So I played around with year and world, and tried to look at different combinations of that, and ultimately came up with the year the world was mine. And I thought that I just liked the sound of that, and it also said everything, because I really looked at the world as if it was my oyster that year. And the subtitle then says a lot more than the title doesn't say, which is that it talks about my Anglophilia, it talks about my being based in England, and it talks about being 50 that year. So all of those things together brought the title together, really. But I did experiment, and I tried other things. And one of the things that for the longest time, the title was going to be The Total Life. I was going to call it The Total Life, but then I just felt it wasn't real. It had to be about a year, because it was just 1 year. So that's how it came about. And the publishers are open. They give you opportunities to play around with titles and see what you like and what works for you. And they also advise, and they say, I think this is a great title, this will work. And I have to tell you, I was quite surprised by the fact that people told me that they actually picked up the book because the title provoked them. They were interested enough when they read the title to decide, hey, this book sounds interesting. Let me look at it.
Hi, Rochelle, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So I spent last year an incredible month in Greenland while my daughter was doing a film. And it was me and my daughter and my 5-year-old granddaughter, and then 2 other people. And we just had the most incredible experience and met lots of people. We met people, for instance, like the boatman that we hired for the entire time, who went out and did the filming, when they did the filming and the sound recordings. If I don't remember his name or anything, I mean, I would only write about him positively anyway, but would I be obligated to try to find him I would have wonderful descriptions of him, and I remember him well, but I don't really have a contact with him.
You don't need to search him out or talk about him unless you're going to use his real name. Are you intending to use his real name?
No, that's what I was asking, whether I should make up another name.
Yes, if you're not going to be able to trace him and to run your manuscript by him, then I would suggest you use a fictional name for him. But
Okay.
if you would like to use his real name, because the bulk of your experiences are going to be about things that really happened with him,
Right.
and if you are able to trace him, then share your manuscript with him. But if you're actually using his name, please get his approval first.
And secondly, does anybody ever write a few chapters and have a whole vision for a book and present an unfinished book to a publisher?
No, the publisher will reject it outright. They only want to see completed manuscripts. And the same is true of agents. There's just too many manuscripts that are landing on their tables every day that are actually complete, that they wouldn't even bother with something that's just an idea. But go with that idea to a writer's workshop, or go with that idea to a creative writing workshop and explore that idea there. That would be a great place to develop it.
Yeah, it was transformational because in so many ways.
Oh, I'm sure it sounds fantastic. And again, not many people have written about Greenland. So,
well, I'm 78 and I wasn't physically all that active before I went. And I came back a completely new person physically.
So I do believe that if you write a query letter that says exactly what you said and then give examples of what you mean by how transformative it was.
Well, I hiked on the ice cap for one thing.
There you go.
I mean, really, who ever thought?
Yeah, so these were things that would be very interesting, I think, to a publisher. And this is what you need to say in your query letter.
Okay, thank you. This is great. Thank you so much.
Oh, most welcome. Are there any other questions or comments, or would anybody like to say anything?
We have a lot of thank yous in the chat, just lots of people saying this was so great and helpful.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad that it helped. And if there are any budding writers out there, or if there are people out there who are trying to get their manuscript published, particularly to you, I hope this was helpful. And I hope that you've learned something from the fact that I've been able to share my experiences with you. Very, very special thanks to those of you who actually bought my book and have read it and have shared your views with me and your opinions with me. It was invaluable. And again, very, very special thanks to the Pequot Library for organizing this, and Christine, to you for taking so much trouble to put it all together. Thank you so much to all of you who registered. This was terrific.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I learned so much today.
Excellent, Karishma. I'm so glad. Do stay in touch.
I will email you.
Okay. Okay, great.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Pequot Library again.
Thanks.
Bye, Rochelle. Nice meeting
Bye-bye.
everyone. Good luck.